Hey, Scott from mygrowthrings.com. Here once again is in my sister's basement. Welcome back to our follow-up video to the last video, which was on the saw guard, both upper and lower saw guards on the Shopsmith Mark V Model 500. No, it was on the 505, 510, 520 Mark 7. Sorry, Mark V Model 500 guys. We'll address your concerns here in just a few minutes. So let's go right to the questions. I don't know how to pronounce your name, but it's Drumaganger. He, she, they're a channel member too. You think I'd know how to? I don't know. In the comments, there are several mentions of a chrome coated ring installed backwards. You say that you mentioned that in the video. Can you link that video in the Q&A? Yes, the link will be in the video description here. It is that little knurled ring at the end of the quill, and it's possible that that can be installed backwards. If it is, it throws a lot of things off, including where your saw arbor and blade wind up in your table insert. So it's an important one. Another one. What is the deal with these clever names that I can't pronounce? Uh, Great video. When I got my used 520 Shopsmith, the previous owner used it only in the lathe setup. I went through the instructions for setting everything and lining everything, but couldn't get the knife to align properly because the chrome coated ring was installed backwards. Flipped it around, took a few tries to get the knives aligned. Thanks for sharing. Got it. Okay. Um, Jeffrey says, where do you get bags for your Shopsmith dust collector? Okay, that kind of off topic. I'll link to that in the video description. We're going to be doing a video where we're going to talk all about all the dust collection stuff. I see people's comments about how disappointed they are with the dust collection on their machine. I think there's some things I can share that might be helpful to you. The Baker's Workshop says, refused to get the guards for the greenie. He's got an old 1950s Mark V Model 500, which is two-tone green, hence a lot of folks call them greenies. Would prefer to upgrade to the 520. Also, Scott, what's the lubricant? So I used a spray lube on the guard on these rods right here that are on springs. I used a spray lube. Again, I'll link to that as I always do. In fact, more importantly, I'm going to link to a video that I covered all of the lubricants that I use on my Shopsmith equipment. That's included in that video, and I kind of describe some of the different places that I use various lubricants and why. I think that's worth a look at. Larry said, do you have to loosen the clamp each time you raise or lower the blade of the table? Another said, this is Frankenberry, said, no, the whole thing is attached to the quill, moves in and out with the saw blade as the quill is adjusted. It's the saw table that goes up and down, not the blade. Yeah, it's exactly right. The distance from the blade to the riving knife on the modern guard, that never changes. It's just how much of that blade is exposed from the raising and lowering of the table. It's really critical for the way that that riving knife works and how the anti-kickback device works. We'll get to that in a question coming up. Ed said, good intro for the 510, 520. Any special tips with the 500? Okay, the Model 500 was introduced back in 1953. It was produced well into the 1990s, and it went through a number of guard improvements over the years. I would say the earliest guards protected Shopsmith more than it protected the user. And if you did use them, they were just a pain to install. By the time the 510 model came along in the mid 80s, the saw guards for the 500 model had advanced as far as they could. Here's what I mean by that. The support tubes on the bottom of the Mark V Model 500 table are set fairly close together. You can put a 10-inch blade and a guard for a 10-inch blade between these tubes. But what you can't do is you can't pass a guard that's capable of holding a 12-inch sanding disc. When the folks at Shopsmith decided to kind of take a fresh look at the way the Mark V was built, one of the first things they had in mind was, let's improve the guards. Let's make sure the guards are easy to use and that they give us improved dust collection. And try as they might, they just weren't able to squeeze that between those close together tubes. Well, now think about this. You build a totally new guard system, and it no longer fits between those tubes, that means that your table has to have support tubes that are further apart, but also the carriage, the part that supports the table, has to have holes that are further apart. So everything got completely redesigned back in the mid 80s. Not to say that the original design was bad by any means, but in order to get all the features and benefits that we get from the Mark V 510, later 520, and now the Mark 7, they kind of had to start over. David Hill, thank you for being a channel member. David says, on my 500, the lower guard is about the same, except that the throat is fixed. I modified my lower guard, fitting the shield that is supposed to be mounted to the tie bar with two cap screws, and attached them to the lower guard. The upper guard is mounted on the table tie bar. Okay, so this is clever. What David did was he took the loose shield that mounts to the right-hand side of the table on his guard and mounted it to the guard itself. Very clever. However, the splitter, now the Mark V Model 510, this is a riving knife because a riving knife goes right next to the blade. What the earlier versions had on them was a splitter. And the more blade you exposed, sorry, I'm going to get that right. The less blade you exposed, the more distance there was between the blade and that splitter, thereby increasing the chance of a potential pinch or kickback. So the Model 500, the upper saw guard and splitter are mounted on the back of the table on a little movable, kind of a plastic dovetail, if you will. And so if you move your blade, which is something we can do with the Shopsmith, we can extend the quill, the drill press quill, and move the blade side to side. Check this out. On this model, with the riving knife, when I move the blade back and forth, the riving knife and the upper saw guard travel together because they're all mounted on the quill. Very clever. David, I like your thinking there. That's a really good idea. RAS 1500 says, I am guessing that the blade guard, etc., will not fit on my 1980s vintage Mark V. Is that true? Definitely looks like an improvement over the apparatus that came with my machine. Yes, we've answered that. But on top of that, Mr. Beachcrafter said, I am so sad for missing the features of the 510 by purchasing my Mark V in 1984. One year ahead of the 510. That I'm sad for you as well. Richard says, okay, now I get it. The under table saw guard covers the part of the blade above the arbor and below the table. Not that this is anywhere likely that you'd be sticking your hand, but maybe some parts or pieces of wood could fall through and engage. So I located my saw guards. Will now mount it for the first time in 10 years. Now, where did I put those screws? I'm happy to hear that. Yes, you're exactly right. Um, Richard also found that he follow-up comment says catalog part number 517829. Guess those are the set screws. I wonder if one advantage of the guard is to capture any of the wood parts that get pulled down through the table and escape the lower saw guard. This has happened a couple times when doing really thin rips. Yes, absolutely. Could benefit you there. JJ's Workshop, channel member. Thank you, JJ, and or your workshop. The only thing I have against the lower saw guard is the having to take off the dust collector hose whenever you change a setup. I agree. Um, like taking the saw blade off or putting a sanding disc on. So, yeah, let me show you what I've done. So here's a solution of sorts. For my hose, I've added a coat hanger to this, and I can, when I disconnect it from my lower saw guard, I can quickly hook it right here on my table tube, and that tends to keep it within reach. You might also hook it here on your tubes, maybe down here, but that works for me. Woodshop Nerdery said, you commented once about my sled to raise the guard slightly instead of removing it to disengage the anti-kickback pause. I've used that since. It works well. Otherwise, it catches when you pull back on the sled. That's right. On this guard, there is a line scored. Shopsmith scored a line. And that is where that line should be visible above your stock. So if you're in doubt of what height to position your table, just lay your stock against the blade with the saw off and expose that line. At that point, you are at the proper height. And the problem when you're using a crosscut jig is it's already adding about 3/4 of an inch of thickness. That means that your table's lower than maybe you might otherwise position it. And so I think that some folks are a little bit scared. Um, and and what Tom is talking about is he just happened to be catching his anti-kickback pause. So my recommendation to him was leave your table height exactly where it is, but loosen the guard at the back and ever so slightly raise it up. Okay, not much, not much. Talking maybe 1/4 of an inch. That can often get that to clear. I keep saying anti-kickback pause. That's out of habit. These are really anti-kickback cams on this machine, which don't really dig in quite like anti-kickback paws do. Several people, including James Hall, channel member, mentioned that for non-through cuts where the saw guard can't be used, they've mentioned using a riving knife that's available from Shopsmith that doesn't have an upper saw guard attached to it. It's about $30. I'll link to it. It's a great idea. I don't see why not. Both Chad and Dave from Sassafras Valley commented about how they would tend to keep the riving knife when adjusting it closer to the left-hand side of the blade. Remember, we have the ability to adjust that slightly, so still behind the blade, but favoring the left-hand side. And the idea being, if you swap that blade out for a thin kerf blade, you're more likely to have the kerf from that blade be able to clear the riving knife. If you don't do that, there's a chance you're going to run into the riving knife when you switch to a thin kerf blade. Not a bad idea, guys. The Red Truck Wood Shop said, that's great information. I never thought about how the position of the lower guard should be depending upon shop vac versus dust collector. I stumbled upon the correct solution. My problem is the dust collector still doesn't get all the dust. There's usually some dust flying around me from the top of the blade in a small pile on the carriage. I'm guessing my dust collector doesn't have enough suction, so on. Several people made that comment. Also, James Brunk said that he's adjusted everything on the guards and still gets dust out of the front of the guard. So here's the thing. We're never going to get 100% because there's such force involved. The centrifugal force of that blade passing through the wood just wants to whip those shavings here and there. I think the great news is when using a dust collector in a properly adjusted dust chute, we stand the better chance of at least capturing the dangerous airborne particles. I don't mind sweeping up a little bit when I'm done. I do mind seeing thin layers of dust all over the shop. When I started adjusting my lower saw guard properly for my dust collector, I stopped finding that and stopped dealing with that issue. So, great point. The Grant Alexander said, riving knife versus splitter is an argument I get into all the time in comments on my videos. It seems that people don't understand the difference and don't understand that not all saws have a riving knife. Well, modern saws sold in America now must have a riving knife. So any table saw that you're going to find at sale at retail is going to have a riving knife. On most saws where the blade is moving up and down, they've had to completely redesign the carriage inside the saw that raises and lowers that mechanism. It was something that Shopsmith was way ahead of on back in the 80s. Now it's true, all these saw manufacturers have had to add that feature. Tim from Bad Apple Woodwork said, I find the hardest part of the system is getting the upper saw guard and riving knife in the clamp after you've covered them up with the table. So hard to see where you're aiming. Yeah, so my trick for that is if you lower the table all the way down, you can easily see the clamp in the lower saw guard. Get that in position, Raise the table up, and then always go back and tighten that in place. Excellent questions. Excellent comments. Not enough cheap shots. Make it a great day.